Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today. Today we have Frank Vasquez as a speaker today. Frank was a corporate lawyer for many, many years and also a professor at Georgetown University. So besides being a kick-ass lawyer for many years, he's also a financial independence, personal finance enthusiast with a wealth of knowledge. And his specialty is in safe withdrawal rates. So without further ado, I want to bring in Frank, and I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Alex. So my name is Frank Vasquez, and just a little background on me. I've practiced law for almost 30 years. I'm mostly retired from that. I still have a couple active cases going on. But I also have degrees in economics and engineering. And so I'm a very numbers-oriented person. I have a podcast called Risk Parity Radio, which is all about portfolio construction. That's all it's about. And it's a very nerd's eye view of that. Now, that podcast is associated with a charity called the Father McKenna Center. I sit on the board of the Father McKenna Center, and so it raises money for that institution, which serves homeless people in Washington, D.C. What I want to talk about today is the basics of withdrawal strategies, both from a theoretical perspective and then also from a practical perspective, because that's what I'm living with now. I'm done accumulating. I'm in my drawdown and withdrawal phase. And so I'm speaking to you about that from a personal perspective. But in order to get us all oriented, I think we need to talk first about the theoretical perspectives of what you've heard about withdrawal strategies and safe withdrawal rates. And so that's where we're going to start, and then we'll go to the practical stuff. Along the way, I have references to some resources that you may be interested in that you can find online. I'll try to make those clear, and maybe we'll write them down at some point. I can't promise you that, but we'll do the best we can. So, let's start with the theory behind withdrawals. Now, how many of you have heard of the 4% rule? Just about everybody. How many feel like you have a good understanding of what the 4% rule says and does not say? Okay, a smaller number. How many of you have read Bill Bengen's paper from 1994? I got one. Okay. So in 1994, Bill Bengen, who was an engineer from MIT and went off and worked for a family business for a while, decided he would get into financial services and started his own little practice there. And when he did that, he realized that nobody had done any work in looking at the theoretical withdrawal parameters, or how much somebody could withdraw and what the limits of that were in terms of having a portfolio and how much you withdraw from it. So he did the initial work on that, which has since been built on by many other people. What I think you first need, let's go through what that analysis was and what it says and what it doesn't say. First of all, when we are talking in theory, we are always basing withdrawals off of what you have accumulated. And so these theoretical constructs are not dealing with real people with their actual expenses. They're always saying, okay, this is how much you've accumulated. Let's come up with some kind of automaton kind of withdrawals from this thing and see if it holds up. So the first thing we need to understand about the 4% rule and what Bengen was doing was what the portfolio was that he was analyzing. And he had to simplify it. And he didn't have as much data as we have now, almost 20 years, almost 30 years later. So he just used a very simple portfolio that was mostly stocks, And it did a variation from, say, 30 to 90% stocks. And the other part of it was intermediate treasury bonds. And that's all that was in this portfolio, S&P 500 and intermediate treasury bonds. So the analysis itself is limited to portfolios that look like that. What you will find is that if your portfolio does not look like that, it is going to have a different safe withdrawal rate. So this provided kind of a baseline with a simplified portfolio as to what it was. Now, in order to do this analysis, he had to simplify it even further. And to simplify it even further, what he said was, I'm just going to assume that I start with a rate, and he put in different rates, 4, 5, 6%. He ended up really focusing on a 50-50 portfolio and a 60-40 portfolio. And he said, what I'm going to assume is that the person is going to look at their portfolio at the beginning of their retirement. They're going to take out 4% from that portfolio, regardless of their expenses. They're going to spend that 4% that year. Then the next year, they're going to take that fixed amount and increase it by inflation. And they're going to keep doing that every year. And so they are never going to decrease their spending. They are never going to, for any reason. You are forced to spend all the money, 4% plus, in this construction. And he did that to simplify the calculations. What he actually says in that paper is that, of course, what makes more sense for a real retiree is to vary their withdrawals and take out less when things are going poorly. And that is the way to essentially get around the 4% rule. And we've known that since the beginning. I think people tend to assume something different about the 4% rule, either that it's already incorporating variable withdrawals or that the amount taken out varies from year to year, but it doesn't in that original study. The amount is fixed and keeps going up year after year, regardless of what the actual expenses are of the retiree. They're required to spend all of the money every year without thinking about anything else. So, where did that go then? Where it's gone in the past 30 years is people have come up with various other kinds of withdrawal strategies, theoretical withdrawal strategies, that kind of build off this idea. And so now you can go out and find many different kinds of theoretical withdrawal strategies. One thing that is in common with all theoretical withdrawal strategies is that they're not based on anybody's expenses. They're based on whatever the portfolio has accumulated. And most of them still focus on one of these kind of simplified portfolios. They're always dealing with a portfolio that is basically a percentage that is S&P 500 and another percentage that is either treasury bonds or a aggregate bond fund like BND. And that's the portfolios they're analyzing. It is seldom that you will see somebody actually look at it from the perspective of portfolio construction and thinking, well, if I change my portfolio, how does that change my projected safe withdrawal rate? And I think that is a tool that we can all use, that we're not stuck with the base portfolio. We can hold other things. We are not stuck with a fixed withdrawal that is based on the portfolio size, because we have our expenses that can be modified or adjusted. So that puts all of this stuff back in theory land, and it's kind of nice to know and tells you more about, am I in the ballpark? Have I accumulated enough to be able to manage my retirement? Not, am I going to be in or out and be fixed or going to, fall off a cliff if I don't conform to this theoretical construct. So, what kinds of constructs have we come up with over the past 30 years or so? So the first one is the 4% rule itself. It has a constant dollar withdrawal strategy. What does that mean? The constant dollar is what I described when I said you start with an amount. Here that's 4%, or you could try 5, 6, whatever you want to try. And then you always take that amount plus an inflation adjustment every year going forward. And you never adjust it. You never make it go lower. You don't look at your expenses. You only look at that. You only look at the first year and what you had there and make this inflation adjustment. And so that is the constant dollar strategy. Now, what we've learned about the constant dollar withdrawal strategy is two things. This comes mostly from Michael Kitces, who is a researcher in the financial services area and writes a lot. That name is spelled Kitces. You go to kitces.com, you'll see endless articles about this topic and any other topic you can think about for people in retirement or people accumulating financial assets. So what he teaches us is that on average, you could actually withdraw 6%. And this is based on historical data. If you started in an average period, this kind of withdrawal could go up to 6% and still survive for at least 30 years. This 4% is the boundary, the worst case scenario. 4% is the worst case scenario under this plan. And where do we see that? We saw it essentially if you started your retirement in a year like 1966 or 1967, then you would be running up against this floor. If you started at different years, you could probably take 5 or 6% and have no problem whatsoever. I think people get confused thinking this is an average when this is actually the worst case scenario. It's already built in. This is already an extremely conservative assumption. Okay, so a more realistic way of taking out your money out of at retirement is the constant percentage method. Now, in this method, you look at what your portfolio is every year, and then you take out usually a fixed percentage. So instead of starting with a thing and adjusting it for inflation so it goes up and up and up, a constant percentage withdrawal strategy says, I am going to adjust my withdrawals every year. So they might go down, my portfolio loses 10%, my withdrawals are going to go down 10% the next year, my portfolio goes up 10%, my withdrawals will go up 10% next year. Now again, it is based on portfolio size. It has nothing to do with the retiree's actual expenses. What's nice about that is that you cannot mathematically ever run out of money. Because as your portfolio would decline, you'd be taking smaller and smaller cuts out of it every year. So mathematically, this always lasts forever. What's not nice about it is you have these potentially large swings, which may be mitigated depending on what your portfolio looks like. Because if your portfolio is not very variable, then your withdrawals are not going to be very variable either. If your portfolio is more risky, has a lot of volatility in it, then your withdrawals are going to have similar volatility in that kind of strategy. Okay, now, does anybody have any questions so far? All right, so
under the constant percentage, is there a range of sort of acceptable percentages that are used in the constant percentage method?
Usually about 5% for a retiree. A good example of this is Paul Merriman's personal portfolio. Paul Merriman is a famous personal finance guy, an investment guy. And it's a good example of a portfolio construction and what somebody does. So Paul Merriman's portfolio is half in stocks of all shapes and sizes. He basically uses what he calls the Merriman Ultimate. So 50% of his portfolio is in that. The other 50% of his portfolio is in intermediate treasury bonds and short-term treasury bonds. There are no other kinds of bonds in his portfolio. Every year, he takes out a constant percentage of 5% from his portfolio. Now, he's 75 years old, and they actually don't spend all the money. I think he gives a lot of it away. But that is a good example of somebody using that kind of a strategy. And if you're using this kind of strategy, you can usually take out a higher percentage than, say, the 4. Because depending on what kind of portfolio you have, it's not going to cause you pain, particularly if your expenses are lower than that. You could take out 5% and then walk along spending that year and decide and figure out, well, I only spent 4% this year. The 1% can go back in or be used for the next year. Is a practical matter. That's how that would work. Next question.
So there's some people out there saying 3.3% on some podcasts and stuff. I think bigger, but I don't remember for sure. Yeah. Any comment on that?
Yeah, that would take a whole nother presentation to go through. What that is based on is a crystal ball. What most of the theory of this is based on actual historical data that is usually scrambled in what is called a Monte Carlo simulation to get a set of data that has actually existed in the past and model these portfolios based on that. What you have seen in that Morningstar report and in other reports is somebody saying, I project in the future, based on my crystal ball, that this is what's going to happen. It's going to be different than the past, and it's going to be different in this specific way. The problem with that is it doesn't work, or it has not worked. People have been trying to use these same kinds of crystal balls based on PE ratios, CAPE ratios, other things, since this idea was invented or come up with around 2008. And that kind of methodology for predicting future returns has been a failure. It has not predicted future returns. So where you are with that, I think it's time to let that go. I mean, maybe you can come up with a different methodology that actually will work. But what we can say since 2008, and what Michael Kitces says himself, and he was one of the people that came up with this idea back in 2008, is that that turns out to be wrong. And people are getting too worked up and too conservative in their withdrawals. And so as of last August, or no, it was the end of November, I heard him on a podcast basically saying, now, you could probably take 6% on average. And the 4% is still a good conservative floor. And the rest of this stuff, he has fundamental disagreements with, particularly with people like Wade Pfau, who are in the conservative camp. That Morningstar report that just came out in November is terrible in terms of its assumptions. It assumes that small cap stocks are going to outperform large cap stocks by 60% on average every year for the next 30 or 40 years. And so if you don't believe that, or if that doesn't seem realistic to you, that whole methodology gets stuck in a false assumption to begin with. Oddly enough, it also assumes that knowing that, you hold a portfolio that is actually mostly the stocks that are going to do the worst. So the thing is designed to come up with a small number from its inception. It is designed to give you a smaller number. My theory is that benefits the financial services industry and the financial media. It benefits the financial media because it gives a dramatic story for them to tell. It benefits the financial services industry because it gives a problem for them to solve. Oftentimes their solution to this are annuities and structured products. So a very conservative projection is used to market expensive products to sell to you and me. And that's how the world works with these things. But we are do-it-yourself investors, so we can look at that critically, say this dog doesn't hunt, and go about our business and do it our own way, because we have all of these tools available now that we didn't even have 5 years ago in terms of analyzing portfolios, coming up with portfolios, doing our own Monte Carlo simulations. We can do all that stuff that couldn't be done by an ordinary person 10 years ago. Now I can get online and I can run your portfolio in 5 minutes and get an idea what your safe withdrawal rate would be for your personal portfolio. So sorry about that rant. But that's where I go with that when I make a critical analysis of it. Too often, and certainly the financial media does not make a critical analysis of these sorts of things. They're more like a sports or fashion channel, where it's like, oh, look at this, it came up. Oh, let's, have a drama fest about something for entertainment or purposes. And it's not for real information. It's entertainment, getting clicks and eyeballs to come to the drama festival. Okay, so anything else right now? All right. Let's go talk. I'm going to talk through these relatively quickly, but essentially there are all kinds of different modifications of the constant dollar and constant percentage strategies that people have developed since 1994. One is the idea of guardrails, where if your starting percentage goes down a certain amount, we'll stop. That will never let it go, say, below 80% of what you started with for your withdrawals. If it goes up a lot, we'll stop on the top, and we won't go over a certain amount. So that basically is kind of combining these two things into one set of rules. One of them is called the Bengen floor and ceiling. I should give you a reference here. All of these things are described in more detail, so I'm not going to go through them here in numeric detail. If you go to a site called Portfolio Charts, there is a calculator there called retirement spending. And in this calculator, there is a description of common withdrawal strategies, common theoretical withdrawal strategies, that includes all these and shows you how to put in the right kinds of numbers into their calculator to simulate these different kinds of guardrail strategies and other strategies. And so you can go in there, take a version of your personal portfolio, apply these theoretical strategies in a Monte Carlo simulation, and see what would that have been like for the past 30 or 40 years. How many times did that fail? You can make the percentages go up and down and get an idea of how that works. I've also put a little tutorial about that calculator on YouTube. I have 3 tutorials so far. I'm working out a 4th about this calculator and how that works. It is under Risk Parity Radio on YouTube, and you can go have a look at that. And it will give you a link to this article with all these things. So other kinds of things that have been applied in the theoretical realm, we have ratchets. There's something called the Client 95% rule. Michael Kitces has a Kitces ratchet strategy. A ratchet strategy usually says, well, we're going to set a floor where we start, and if the portfolio becomes worth more over time, we're going to keep increasing spending, not really based on inflation, but based more on the size of the portfolio. So we'll spend more over time. You get to things that end up being multi-factor, something called the Guyton-Klinger, which is a combination of these sorts of things. So it's got an idea that, well, if it goes down this much, we will decrease spending by Y amount. If it goes up, then we'll increase spending by X amount. But all of those things you can just have a look at. And what you always need to keep in mind is these are theoretical constructions. that are not taking into account anybody's actual experience in life or expenses. There is a very interesting one that just came out in November. If you go to Michael Kitz's, I'll give you the name of this article. Okay, and this came out November 24th. It is called the Retirement Distribution Hatchet, Using Risk-Based Guardrails to Project Sustainable Cash Flows. Now, it's a mouthful. It's at kitsis.com. But he talks about a number of these sorts of strategies. But is also talking about, well, maybe we should set these guardrails not by how much the portfolio goes down, up or down, but by how much its theoretical withdrawal rate would be if we ran a Monte Carlo simulation on it every year. The idea, you go and run a Monte Carlo simulation on your portfolio. If your portfolio could survive, usually what the Monte Carlo simulation will yield is basically saying, if you hold this portfolio at this and withdraw at this percentage, it fails 5% of the time, or 10% of the time, or 1% of the time. And the idea of doing it this way would be, if it's going to only fail 1% of the time or 5% of the time, then you know you can increase spending. And if it looks like it's going to fail, 20% of the time, then you decrease spending. But it's just another method of putting guardrails on one of these things. And all of these things are basically designed to get around this problem about the 4% rule, which is, what is the maximum we can withdraw? And I think that is really the fundamental difference between what you're trying to do when you're accumulating assets as opposed to what you're trying to do when you are decumulating or living on your assets. That accumulation is easy theoretically to think about because you just want more money until you get to a point where, okay, I know what my expenses are, and I know I need about this amount of money, and so I get to be done at a certain point. When you are in the decumulation phase, your goals are typically different. If you are still doing that, still trying to accumulate money, what that implies with is that your goal is to die with as much money as possible. So, and maybe that is your goal. Maybe you want to leave a huge legacy to somebody. But if you're still using the same portfolio that you used to accumulate, your implied goal is to die with as much money as possible. What most people actually want to do when they think about it is to maximize their spending while they're in decumulation. And that means changing your portfolio because a portfolio designed for accumulation long-term looks different. It is more aggressive, it takes more risk, doesn't care about volatility. A portfolio that you're drawing down from wants to take less risk, be less volatile, because it's really that depth of drawdown and length of potential drawdown that determines your safe withdrawal rate for a given portfolio. That those two factors are more important than just the average accumulation number. And that's why you can take a portfolio that is more conservative, will have a higher safe withdrawal rate than a portfolio that has, say, 100% stocks in it. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But, okay, so I'm going to leave the theoretical stuff alone now. Does anybody else have questions about this part of things?
Do you know if required minimum distribution, the calculation, is that normally less than 4%?
Yeah, the required minimum distribution that you're talking about is a IRS rule that applies now to people who turned 72. It is based on actuarial tables. So it is based on the same tables that insurance companies use. And it basically starts around 4% when you're 72. But actuarially, it's basically saying, well, what is the projected lifespan of this person? And then we divide it by a factor, and that's how much they're forced to take out. So that it's effectively a ratchet that you start at 72 with around 4 or 5%. By the time if you live to like 90, the RMDs are like 10, 13%. because you're only projected to live, another 5 or 8 years. That table is actually on the IRS website. You can look at it, but it's going to vary based on how old you are. And I think it also varies based on gender, although I'm not sure that's true, because I haven't looked at it in a while. But that is also, actually people have used that also as a potential withdrawal strategy. Why don't I look at an actuarial table, see how long I'm projected to live, and then take out use on this RMD calculation, which you could do, going back to your being 30 years old. It'll be like, 2 or 3%, and then it'll keep going up as you get older. But it ends up being kind of weird because you end up hoarding all this money to spend when you get really old. So it's probably not desirable from a living perspective. But it would work in terms of being able to do it.
Yeah, so the RMD is only on the portion of your portfolio that is where you've taken the tax deduction to put the money in the pre-tax portion. And it doesn't require that you spend the money, right? It's just required that you pay the taxes on the money. You could stick that rest of the money in your checking account, or you can reinvest it, you can do whatever you want with it.
Yes.
It's just saying you now have to pay taxes on that amount of money.
That's a very good point, that the RMD legally applies only to essentially traditional IRAs and 401ks, and also Roth 401ks. If you still have a Roth 401k, RMDs apply to that. So if you have one, you want to roll it into a Roth IRA, and then the RMDs don't apply to it. Which is a completely weird rule that only the tax authorities can come up with. So, yeah, you're right. It just forces you to move it out of that account, pay the tax on it, and then you can reinvest it, spend it. Another strategy is if you're giving money to charity, I think you can designate it straight from the account into the charity and then reduce your taxes by that much on a charitable deduction. There probably aren't any of us in this room that are subjected to this yet. But we all will be eventually, assuming we have those kinds of accounts. Okay, so we have another.
Are all of these strategies evaluated over 30 years, or do any of them get evaluated over a longer time horizon? I mean, we all sort of are striving for the early side of the retirement, so maybe a 40, 50, even in some cases 60 plus years.
What you'll find is that, you can put in longer time periods. 30 years, again, was just used for a simplified time period. And as you get further out, it kind of flattens out. That there's a big difference between a 10 and a 20 year, so a smaller difference between a 20 and a 30 year. When you get to 30, 40, 50 years, that safe withdrawal rate or projected safe withdrawal rate or permanent withdrawal rate tends to flatten out. And so it's not that much different. But this is also a misunderstanding that many people have, that they say, oh, it's only good for 30 years, and like you're going to fall off a cliff or go in a hole at 30 years. And the chances are, actually, you're going to have a lot more money by then in most scenarios. And in a few scenarios, or one scenario, you would be running out of money or close to it using this constant dollar withdrawal strategy. Question back there.
Frank, would you still say, if you're in the very beginning stages of the accumulation phase, that the 4% rule is something that you would still, for me, when someone's really young, in their 20s, 30s, and they're just starting out in this journey, for them to have an answer to how much they need to retire, 4% rule is so simple, it allows them to see that. Would you still give that advice for someone who's really early on to just use that for a very bare, simple calculation?
Yes, as a base estimate for how much you'll need. That is still a very good target. It's actually a conservative target, that you may only need 20x in reality. Having 25x is a conservative target. And there is an issue in the FIRE community of people competing on this. It's oh no, I'm going to go to 30. I'm going to go to 40. It's why? Well, we don't need to compete on how much money we accumulate, because that implies the idea that we're never going to die. Or our goal in life is to accumulate as much money as possible on the date of death and not spend it. So yes, you will essentially be, if you get too conservative on that, you're basically saying, I want to accumulate more money than I really need for whatever psychological benefits that gives you, so you can tell your fellow fire person, it's like, well, you got 4%, 25, I've got 30. And it becomes a kind of weird psychological competition is what I found.
As people are transitioning to starting to decide what their withdrawal strategy is going to be, I'm curious to know, when people call into your show or reach out to you, or I know this is your specialty, how are people making that decision, have you found? Like which strategy they're going about? They
Typically are looking at the expenses to be covered, and they really what they just want to know is, am I going to be okay? Fundamentally, that is what they realize looking at these theoretical things. It's like, well, that's not what I'm planning on doing. I know what kind of my expenses are, and what I want to, what else I want to spend on. How am I going to match what I've accumulated to what my projected expenses are? And then the bigger question for most people is, where is that money going to come from on a month-to-month or year-to-year basis? Which accounts is it going to come out of? How do I get it out of my IRA without paying extra taxes or penalties on it? How much do I need that's already outside of that? What if I have some rental real estate? How do I account for that? So there are a lot of personal questions that none of this theory deals with. And you'll find as you get there, it's sort of like those personal questions as to my particular situation just sort of crowd out these theoretical considerations, because it comes down to more to, okay, this is how much I have. This is how much I need to spend, actual spend. And it doesn't have anything to do with, your expenses typically do not have anything to do with what you've actually accumulated. Because that's not how we work. we don't necessarily dial in our expenses based on this 4% rule as we accumulate. We just sort of go along, spend what we spend, and then think about, okay, well, how much do I need to accumulate on that side? And then it becomes an estimate that we can then work with. That does kind of segue into the next section here.
So do any of these strategies, I mean, I've heard a lot about a big part of the safe withdrawal rate is take into account the first 5 or 10 years when you're kind of in the danger zone if you have a huge market downturn. So do these sort of take that into account, or did all these come out before they even thought that was an issue? Like, is there a special with strategy to make sure that that's okay?
Indirectly, they take it into account. What you'll find is when they do the analysis is that the failure rate does come out in those historical years where you started with what is called the sequence of return risk, that it fell off a cliff to begin with, and your investments didn't do very well. A couple ways to deal with that is, first one being, well, hold a different portfolio that will do better in those environments, a more diversified portfolio than this this S&P 500 bond thing. You're not stuck with that. And then the second way to deal with that, or other way to deal with it, is just a modification of your portfolio that is basically looking at some kind of bond tent or cash reserve to start with. You can describe it in either way. In either respect, it's just kind of looking at, from one perspective, you're just doing it all as one portfolio. From another perspective, you're kind of segmenting it out, thinking, oh, I'm going to need this much in this day. It still boils down to, what am I going to hold? Whether you're looking at it, it's to me, it's like looking at a staircase from the side and seeing the stair steps. or looking at it from the front and just seeing things on levels. It's the same set of stairs. You're just looking at it from a different perspective. But yes, that is the idea behind that, is that you can mitigate the 4% rule or by changing the composition of your portfolio, and that gets you around or out of that. But the other way of saying the same thing is you can hold a portfolio that has a higher projected safe withdrawal rate than the one they used for the projections. So a lot of...
I guess what I'm saying though is, I'm not sure, do these strategies inherently protect you from sequence risk?
Yes.
Or do I need to pick one of these strategies and keep a pile of money over here just in case?
No, they already incorporate that. That's why that's why it's 6% on average and 4% on floor, because that 4% floor is the situation where you have the worst sequence of returns. Whereas the average is more like just retiring in an average year. So this implicitly is designed to deal with the worst sequence of return risk that you've historically had. Right. And sort of going back to the question of, well, what if it's 3.3? Then of course, if you manufacture a lower safe withdrawal rate and manufacture a projected different sequence of return risk that's never occurred, then you will have a lower safe withdrawal rate when you do run that calculation. Yes.
In real life, people's expenses are not constant year over year. Even when you're working, right? I mean, you're replacing your cars, you put a down payment on a house, college for your kids, daycare for your kids, whatever it is. The expenses are changing over the time, and it continues on in retirement. At some point, cars still have to get replaced, and maybe you now have a large portfolio and you want to buy a nicer car than the beater you were driving when you were young. In addition, the healthcare costs start to creep in, and for some period in your older years, you may have some very significant healthcare costs. So how does this take all that into account? I look at this sort of as building an allowance for yourself.
Yeah.
And if the allowance is higher than what you need, okay, well, you just keep moving that money into, after tax kind of stuff. And, it's there. It's that bucket for, these other things. If you want to take a round the world cruise, you look at the bank and you say,
right.
There's more money than we need. Let's take the cruise.
And that is the practical way we're going to manage our portfolios that we're going to actually get here to next. What you're talking about in theory, and it's funny, this is also described in that Michael Kitz's article from November that I just mentioned, and it's called the retirement smile, is what they call it in financial advisor lingo, and it is the recognition that typically a retiree who's retiring at an average age, 60s or something, starts out at a higher level. Their spending actually goes down for like the first 10, 20 years of retirement, and then goes up at the end based on healthcare considerations. And so a lot of the new fangled strategies are designed to account for that reality, because the fact of the matter is we tend to spend less as we get older and can't move around as much. You're going to have a longer period of your go-go years, is what they call this. There's literally, if you sit down with a financial advisor, they're going to say, okay, we're going to plan for your go-go years, then your slow-go years, and then your no-go years. These are the technical terms that the financial services industry uses for this issue. So your go-go years, which are younger, are going to be longer, is basically the short answer to that. But this gets at the matching of assets to expenses. All right, I am going to move along. Yeah.
So, has anyone taken a stab at trying to factor in black swans? essentially. So it seems like, the Monte Carlo simulators, they're basically trying to go back as far as they can to get as much data as they can, and then pumping through all scenarios through that data set. And it sounds great. It's like, oh my God, 100 years, that covers everything. But in the grand scheme of things, 100 years actually sounds pretty small. And, understanding that we've had one depression and one period of really bad inflation, and most recently the longest non-recession period in history. So obviously outliers happen. And I know that you can't predict the unpredictable, but has anyone taken a stab at trying to say, like, okay, what happens if we have 2 or 3 depressions in a row, or a period of 30 years of unexpected prosperity, or, this inflation, which is actually, 50% or something, just really odd situations, or like a Japanese economy kind of thing.
40 years of darkness, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. Yes, is the answer. And the way it's done is this. And you can do this. Another resource that you want to take down and look at is there's a very sophisticated Monte Carlo simulator at the site called Portfolio Visualizer, which has a complete set of the kinds of calculators that professionals have been using, but now are available to us as do-it-yourself investors. And it's all on that site, and it's got all the data loaded into it. Now, what you can do in that simulator is tell it to, okay, I want you to put the worst years first of all the years that have happened, to give me a simulation of several depressions in a row, to make it harder. And so you can do that simulation on your portfolio and come up with results. So there's a lot of tools you can, another thing you can do there is say, okay, my expenses are going to be this for this period of years, and then they're going to change and go to this. and then you could also put in, and I think it's going to be worse. We're going to have 40 years of darkness. So I'm going to change that to make the sequence of returns even worse than it has been historically, and see what that does to my portfolio. So yeah, it's there. You can do it, and that is the answer to a lot of these things. That there are these kind of stories about how bad it's going to be, but we need to stop telling stories and start looking at numbers, because we have these tools that we can actually simulate what people are talking about, and stop talking about it and look at the reality of it and how we're going to fix it, because there are solutions to all these problems. And sort of whinging about the 40 years of darkness and the dogs and cats living together really is not very productive when it comes down to it. You can sort of tell you that we have cognitive biases that basically say a dramatic story told over and over again makes us feel like it's more likely to happen than it actually is. So we misassign probabilities as human beings to a dramatic story than what the actual probability of that thing happening. But that's just another thing to take into account, because I do feel like this is also a problem in the FIRE community, people competing on negative stories. In the same way they compete on how much they have, what X they have of their expenses. So the first thing we need to think about is our practical withdrawal strategy is going to be expense-based. As personal human beings, these are my actual expenses. My actual expenses are not dependent on the size of my portfolio. That's not how life works. You know what these are because you've been living through them, and you probably use those to give an estimate as to what you need to accumulate. But nobody goes and says, okay, now that I've accumulated $3 million and my expenses are actually only $50,000, I'm going to start taking out a whole lot more money just because of some theoretical rule. You might feel more comfortable taking out more money, you might do that, but ultimately you're gonna be looking at what your expenses are to determine what you might take out. Couple things here. So we talked about, this is like a ballpark that I think is good for people to think about. So basically, when you are targeting how much to accumulate, you're probably targeting in here somewhere. 3, 4, 5 is probably what you're targeting in terms of accumulation. Once you get in this thing, you're over accumulated. There's been no instances where a 3% withdrawal strategy came anywhere close to being what was necessary. And so that idea is, again, a scare narrative that people keep repeating as if it has validity. Mathematically, it has not. Historically, it has not. But then you're thinking, okay, well, we know on average, though, the average situation, that's, I could spend up to 6% based on what my beginning is. So when you are gliding into your retirement, you're probably going to end up somewhere in here. And then as you manage your expenses, they can be anywhere in here, and you can feel very comfortable. They might pop out to here occasionally. You got to put a new roof on the house or something. But they might not stay out here. And so you want to stay in the ballpark, basically, is what you ought to be thinking about, not applying some theoretical expenses that aren't your actual expenses. Go ahead.
So if you hit 6%, would it make sense to pull a line of credit on your portfolio to accommodate for the extra interest and just pay it off over different years, and then you wouldn't have to withdraw as much from your portfolio?
You could do that, or depending on what your portfolio looks like, you might just be taking out of the cash equivalents that are in there, because most people are going to have part of their portfolio that is short-term bonds or some other thing that looks kind of cash-ish. And so, yeah, taking a line of credit against something, particularly if you have an account at like Interactive Brokers, you can borrow at 1% from there, can be done. So that's one way of dealing with it. But what I'm talking about here is really the idea that we can never go, out of these little circles is just not true. As a practical matter, it's okay to go out here for a year or a couple of years if we know we're going to slide back here anyway, and that this expense that put us out here is the roof on the house or is some big thing. That does get to another issue with the portfolio constructions themselves, is that when you get to accumulation, you were taught in decumulation, you were taught in your accumulation phase you need this emergency fund to deal with these sorts of things. When you get to decumulation, that can be folded into your overall portfolio, that you shouldn't need a separate emergency fund because part of your portfolio in decumulation is going to be cash and cash equivalents. Most people will have up to a year of that stuff in their savings accounts, I-bonds, other things like that, that will essentially cushion them in those sorts of situations. So as a practical matter, I divide, and this is sort of getting more, how do I do this? I've come up with some basic categories to think about. First one is what I call the KLO expenses. That stands for keep the lights on. So this is looking at your expenses and what you really need to do. And what people get obsessed about the portfolio and the safe withdrawal rate and all that sort of stuff. The most important thing to do as you get to retirement is to know what your expenses are. Go sit down, look at what they've been, look at where they've come from, and think about, am I going to have that going forward or not? Because if you're living in the same house, your taxes, utilities, all that stuff, it's going to be the same or close to it. It's not going to change that much. But that's what we're talking about here. How much would it cost for me to just keep living in my house or apartment and paying all the expenses I'm required to pay, taxes, utilities, if I still have a mortgage, I got to pay that. And, basically I'm not going out and spending a lot of money. I'm not going on very expensive vacations. I'm just kind of living a base with my base life. And I think a good target for those is something less than 3%, which is not too bad to get to. That if you know that, because what you're thinking here is that, okay, if things go really bad in my portfolio or whatever, I can dial back to here and still live and be fine. And then maybe things will get better and then I can spend more. So this goes this is the practical methodology for thinking about a variable withdrawal strategy. That getting to these expenses and knowing what they are helps us. Typically over time, because of that smile that they talk about, this tends to go down, particularly in inflation-adjusted dollars. Because if you have paid off your mortgage or have a fixed rate mortgage, you are not subject to housing inflation. Your rate goes down. And in an odd respect, if you can keep your personal inflation rate lower, your taxes go down too. The reason your taxes go down is because the tax brackets that the IRS puts out are adjusted upward based on CPI inflation. So if your personal rate of inflation is lower than the CPI, then you are actually benefiting from the way the rest of the world works. And in retirement, except for healthcare, you have a lot of control over your personal inflation rate because you're not buying lots of education. You're not necessarily buying lots of gas to go back and forth to work. A lot of the things that you were forced to do when you were working, you're not constrained to do anymore and can just do something different. The housing is the big thing though for that. So that's what I look at when I'm looking at our budget. And the way my wife and I look at budget, it was funny, I didn't used to budget much when I was accumulating because it was just like, just save all that over here, we'll spend this, and we have some left over, well, we'll save that again too. So it's like save on the front end and the back end. And since I was making more money over time, and we kept our expenses relatively constant or lower than the rate of increasing income, it was very easy. When we got to retirement, it's like, okay, wait a second. now I actually need to focus on, well, what are we spending? And what are we spending it on? And how much do we need to do these sorts of things? And so I've actually done a whole lot more budgeting, and I sit down with her every month and we look at, all right, what are we spending on? And we figured out how much that is now. And we have a very good idea of what our KLO is in terms of what are the things that come up every month we got to pay. Go ahead.
I actually have a question from a friend, from a 5 friend that lives at another states. How would you budget healthcare? Maybe especially toward the I think the closer to the end of life, the last couple of years. How would you budget that?
I honestly wouldn't worry too much about what your healthcare expenses are going to be in 30 years, because the chances are you'll be dead in a different way than the most expensive way. What you really should focus on is, what are my healthcare expenses now, particularly an early retiree, and you're getting your healthcare from the ACA or whatever. That is a major expense to deal with and needs to be budgeted for. That is sort of one of the major ones. What you'll find, a lot of retirees that are in more of the middle income area are going to get subsidized on their healthcare for that. But that is a key thing. I don't know that there is a very good solution for dealing with every kind of end of life outcome. For instance, my parents are 92 and 88, and they're still walking around, driving and living like normal people.
Some of us have parents who are that age that are in long-term care facilities
Yep.
that are crazy expensive.
Yeah.
So we got to worry about, is that in our future? So it is something to sort of take into account, right?
It is.
I don't think we can just push it off and just say,
But how?
it'll be
what
covered.
I'm saying is, how are you going to take it into account? How do you know what you're
I
going
think
to
of it
need?
like a white swan event. Like, this is something that could happen.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to throw out a number and say it could cost X amount.
Okay.
So
Well, the chances are also that if you are following these rules, your portfolio will multiply several times. So the chances, if you take into all the probabilities into account, the chances are you're going to have a lot more money. And that is a decision to be made more closer to that time than trying to predict today. And this gets into the catastrophizing. That, okay, I'm gonna predict that we're gonna have the worst sequence of returns, worse than it's ever been. I'm gonna be in long-term care starting at age 71 until age 85. You can catastrophize and come up with scenarios that no, you won't survive. Your portfolio will blow up. But the chances of all of those things happening together are pretty small, unless, I mean, we have a nuclear war or something that takes us out of that. But I agree it's a concern. What I don't agree is that it is something that we can necessarily fix right away. Because the uncertainty of just knowing what is healthcare going to be like in 30 years. We don't know. So yeah, I think what's of higher concern is, how am I going to deal with healthcare now for the next 10 years to get me to, say, Medicare, or 20 years if you're earlier? How am I going to get there? Because then because that's your immediate real problem that you can identify and analyze and deal with. The other factor in that is, this is a non-financial, your solutions in many cases are non-financial for health. Take care of yourself. Don't be overweight. Take your meds, take your blood pressure, go get yourself a colonoscopy when you're supposed to. All that sort of stuff is a way of mitigating this end-of-life problem that is non-financial. That's the way my parents dealt with it. My father was working around outside. He was backpacking until he's 85. And just walking around a lot is the difference between a healthy old age and an unhealthy old age. And it's just that simple for a lot of this. Yeah.
It sounds to me, just from this conversation, that extended life could be more probable than dying early. So are these, let's say they cure cancer, they come up with something where you're not dying at age 80, you're dying at age 105, right?
Right.
So do these numbers still work if that scenario?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because you're probably going to have more money. In most scenarios, you're actually going to have multiples of money. That we talked about the average withdrawal rate is 6% for average years. If you retire in a good year, and if you retired in 2010 and you had all the money, and you watch your portfolio grow from there, you could be spending 8, 9, 10% and still have more money. And so there is a large chance, probably over 50%, that your portfolio is going to be substantially larger as time goes on. And once you get past that sequence of returns at the beginning, those first 10, 15 years, all of a sudden you may have just a lot more money than you could ever possibly need. And then you could reallocate some of that to some kind of long-term care policy if you wanted one. I'm not aware of any good, cost-effective long-term care policies out there. Every time somebody asks this question, I see what the answer is. As far as I can tell, they don't really exist. Your mileage may vary, but that's sort of where we are in the great scheme of things. maybe our healthcare system will change and make more of that kind of care more available to more people. I have to believe that a lot of things will change, since now we have people running around with pig hearts and things, which I thought was like a Seinfeld episode. The pig man. Anyway, getting off track, or getting back on track. So the next category I put is what I call the comfort category. And we're going to be spending 0 to 2% in that. What is that? That is your kind of basic vacations, going out to eat, joining a gym, having people come and clean your house, having people come and do your yard work, all of the things that you can spend money on that is going to save you time or make your life more comfortable. And they're usually not, they're the sort of things that's like, if I had to, I could get rid of my gym membership. I could clean my own house. I could do my own lawn, or so. But
you say cancel Netflix? I gotta see what happens to this.
Well, that's what your children are for. It's like what you find as you get older is that different members of the family will sign up for different services, and then it's sort of like, well, who's got the Hulu password? And that there ends up being a kind of natural sharing going on with respect to that stuff. But yeah, that would in fact fit. You could put that in one of these two categories, because if you can't do any of this comfort stuff, you can't afford it, Netflix becomes very cheap in terms of entertainment, that I can always just sit here and watch Netflix if I can't go out to eat. That the cost of that per day is so small that that it becomes sort of one of the things you can still keep, as opposed to your wine collection. After that, you do get to what I call style and fun. And this is the stuff that probably doesn't happen every year. Going on a big vacation that costs, thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars with a whole group of your family. That would be sort of one idea. Buying a boat or an expensive car could be also these sorts of things. What I think you want to, and where I am, is that I kind of want this whole thing to be less than 5% or around 5% when I'm done most of the time. Because this one's not, I'm not going to be making this expense all the time. What's going to happen is this one is what I have to pay. This is what I'm probably going to be paying unless things go weird or bad. And then this stuff I'm going to be looking at, hey, wait, I got more money this year. Things are good. Let's go to Bora Bora instead of going to the Jersey Shore. And so, but this becomes a more expense budgeting issue, sort of thinking about what I'm really doing with my money and where it's going, as opposed to just trying to come up with a number based on a portfolio and then deciding I have to spend 5% this year. Chances are after a few years, your total expenditures, this is going to sink down to 2%. Because your portfolio is growing. And so you're going to end up in a place that's like, I can start giving money away or transferring it in advance to my heirs. One good thing to do with that is fund your kids' Roth IRAs, with things like that. But that also comes into this, that I could do it or not, depending on what how my situation has evolved over time. But those are all the consideration, and I think that is why sitting down and doing a realistic budget and thinking about what categories these things are in makes management of this relatively painless, and you're not stuck theorizing 4% rules based on the size of your portfolio that you're living your life.
So I think it might be because of my background, but I find my risk tolerance is much higher than most people.
Yeah.
And I'm looking to, rather than doom and gloom it, like you said, 6% might be a good average.
Yep.
Rather 4% floor. what is the ceiling? Because me, I want to push it. I do not want to have a fantastic vacation at 90. I want to spend the next 15 years with my kids, having the best 15 years of my life. And then if I have to Netflix it out from there, fine. But like, to me, I think knowing the KLO and having that at the 3% and having that knowledge that I can get flexible if the sequence of returns risk hits me hard, and boom, we go down to KLO level, fine. But I would want to go outside these circles to 8%, to 9%. I do not want a situation where I have much more money than I mean, other than the ability to give back to charities, to pass on to my heirs. I still want to do those things. But do you disagree or do not advise against targeting something like a 7 or an 8% if that's my
I think it's definitely manageable, particularly if you have the option of going back to work. Because all of this is assuming that you don't have any other income and will never have any other income other than what's in your portfolio. And once you get, that's another unrealistic assumption that we start with, that in reality, I mean, we're all going to have something for Social Security at some point. Most of us are going to have some residual income or side income or some other thing. And then some people will have the option to simply go back to work because of the nature of what they did. And so all of those things can get you even more, a better margin, if you will, and allow you to spend more money. Okay. And I haven't even talked about any of those things, but.
So you have all the potential sources of income you could generate, whether it's your career or a hobby, a side hustle or whatever, that's definitely not incorporated into this. And then
right.
I just think about the flexibility of saying, if we can drop down, that means we can also go up.
Right. And then there are other things like, and we're going to get to this next, as to the nature of your, of what you own and how that plays into what you can spend, or where's the money coming from, is the next question. Now we talked about what your expense categories would be. Now we're going to talk about where's this money actually going to come from in your retirement. And I divide or categorize assets in 3 categories for this purpose. The first category we have here is liquid financial assets. These are your investment accounts, primarily. That any day you could go into your investment account, sell something, and get the cash in your account very quickly, and then spend it. And so that applies to anything that can be liquidated without really much of any effort. You would put your taxable brokerage account, your 401k, assuming it's invested in funds, your IRAs, all of that stuff. Now, there may be some steps you need to deal with in terms of getting money out, converting, and all that sort of stuff. But the fact of the matter is those are liquid and could be spent, even if you have to pay some penalties. The next category are illiquid income generating. This is things like a pension, real estate that's generating rentals, that has a net income. Anything that is putting money into your pocket. This could also include your side job or some other job. The idea being you can't easily sell that thing. You can't sell your pension. You can't just go out and sell your rental right away. You have to take some effort into it. But you're going to get income coming out of those things. And so these are the good categories. And then we have our bad category down here, which is your illiquid, non-income generating assets. This is the house you live in. This is the car you drive, your clothes, your personal effects, your coin collection, your Beanie Babies. All of that stuff that is worth something, but it's not paying you any income. In fact, many times it's costing you money to keep, because you have to pay taxes in your house and upkeep. And so when you are thinking about sliding into retirement, you really want to be thinking about, well, I really need these things to be paying for my life. And although this is part of my net worth, it's not worth very much. in terms of actually managing my life and my expenses. In practice, what you end up doing is this. You're taking your expenses, then you're usually subtracting what you've got here. So if you have your pension, my expenses are $5,000 a month, the pension covers $1. My rentals cover another $1,250. So you take that expense line, you subtract those things off, and then you know what else needs to be covered. And that's really the easiest way of managing and thinking about, do I have enough money to retire? How am I going to manage that? What am I going to do? And then you're going to look at your liquid financial assets to be covering that other thing. They may be paying some income themselves or not. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter if you have dividends coming out of this thing or not, because you could just sell it. Whether it's keeping all the money inside it and they're doing share buybacks or it's paying a dividend, it doesn't matter. You can just sell it whenever you want. And so the only question here then becomes these other issues of what kind of account is it? Do I need to convert it at some point? Am I going to have extra taxes on it? Am I going to have any taxes on it? If it's a Roth, how much of it can I take out because I contributed to it? And I've had it for 5 years, all those sorts of things. But typically what you're going to do is sit down every month or quarter or however often you do this, looking at your budget, and then you literally look at what we do every month is look at what our budget is, look at where a few things are coming from. I've got some of this residual from my old job coming back, and then we usually need to cover with the liquid financial assets. In this category, you typically have either as part of your portfolio or mentally separate, even though it's no different, most retirees have between 1 and 3 years of cash or cash equivalents. And this allows you to be actually looking at your other portfolio and saying, oh, well, everything else is going up. I'll sell some stocks this month or this quarter, and we'll use that. Or it's like, well, the stocks are doing terrible. So let's just spend down our cash pile for a while. And so that is ultimately the way you manage these things. But matching this up with what you are actually spending is sort of the mechanics of what we are doing there. And what's interesting about this is it takes it out of this whole safe withdrawal rate discussion. You're just doing matching. It's sort of like, well, I got this, I match it with that. I got this, I match it with that. And you're not thinking about what percentage of this, as to my whole portfolio, is going on there. So you end up kind of doing it backwards. You fill out these things, you match them up, and then later on, well, how much was that as a percentage of stuff? Is it closer to 3? Is it closer to 6? Or what is it? And maybe next month, if it's getting too high, you're going to cut down on some of those fun things or comfort things or whatever. Or if it looks like things are doing well, it's like, all right, well, maybe I can buy that boat. And so this ends up being a very fluid process. And it is kind of like riding a bike or operating some kind of financial vehicle. I always like the analogy of I guess it was the second Road Warrior movie, where all those people were in that compound with the oil and stuff. And they, towards the end of the movie, they basically abandoned that, blew it up, and went off on the road. And your retirement is kind of like that, because they had all the gas and all the resources in their cars, but how exactly they went along the road was up to them. You could slow down, you could speed up, drive around obstacles. That's the way it really is. It's not like it's a set it and forget it, that you don't have a self-driving car that's going to go from Baltimore to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, without looking at what's going on the road, slowing down when the weather's bad and doing other things. So that is the way I like to think about managing this, that it is a in-the-moment reactive process, that you have already set it up, that you have the guardrails, it's going to work. Exactly how it's going to work from month to month is something that you are going to manage and be comfortable managing, because you're not an automaton. You are not forced to spend certain monies at certain times, and you can make adjustments along the way. And in that respect, your decumulation phase is not that significantly different from your accumulation phase, when you could switch jobs or decide how much you wanted to work or move here or there. You're still going to do all those things. It's just going to be a different little way of managing your money with respect to that. When we were talking about those financial assets, those liquid financial assets, they're in this portfolio. And as we've discussed, the projections of 4% rule and other things were made on the basis of a specific limited portfolio composed of the S&P 500 and some bonds that are either all treasuries or a mixture of corporate and treasuries. In reality, we can invest in all kinds of things. We can invest in different parts of the stock market. Small cap value stocks are well known as being both something that outperforms the market over long periods of time and does well in inflationary environments like these big growth stocks don't. So one easy thing to do is simply take that S&P 500, and instead of just investing in all that, which is essentially a large cap growth portfolio, take a chunk of that, put it in small cap value stocks. Take another chunk of that, put it in Reits. Those things are going to be diversified and give you just as good or better performance over time as this S&P 500 portfolio. But the question is, got a little bit off track there, is what are we maximizing for this portfolio construction? Now, when we were accumulating, we were trying to maximize the accumulation. We were trying to get to a targeted number based on our expenses. And the best way to do that is to invest in basically 100% stock funds and things like that. What we didn't care about at that point in time, because we weren't drawing any money off of this, we don't care about volatility in our accumulation portfolio. We're not worried that there's going to be a 10-year drawdown because we're putting more money into it. So it ends up being a forced dollar cost averaging over time, and will grow you away on that accumulation. I think the best example of that is somebody who started investing at the peak in 1929, putting their money into the stock market. They did not see the same level in the market itself until 1954. It was a 25-year dip. But if they just invested through that whole time, their actual returns would be over 11% annualized, even though looking at the chart, the stock market didn't go anywhere. But that shows you how accumulation works. That's different when we get to retirement. We're taking money out. We're not putting money in. So what we care about is being able to take money out and being able to take as much money out as possible without going off a cliff, if you will. That requires a different kind of portfolio. And what you should be thinking of is, for every portfolio, there is a projected safe withdrawal rate. And it's different for every portfolio. How do you figure out what yours is? Use two places for tools. I mean, there's a lot of different tools. The best ones I've found these days for this purpose are the ones at Portfolio Visualizer. They have a couple different back testers. You can put in your own ticker symbols. You can put in asset classes for those. It'll give you historicals on what safe withdrawal rates have been for whatever portfolio you're using. The other one is at Portfolio Charts, which is easier to look at. That one goes back to 1970, a little bit longer time series. It doesn't allow you to put in ticker symbols but that also gives you a nice way of evaluating what is my safe withdrawal rate for various portfolios. And I'll talk about some projections in a little bit here for just some samples or ideas. So when you are maximizing your safe withdrawal rate, it turns out there are a few factors that go into this. One is still the compounded annual growth rate. How much is this expected to grow if we just grow it? Where people get in trouble here is if they have too many assets that are cash equivalents. They've got too many short-term bonds, too many tips, too much cash. All of that stuff is going to kind of drag down your compounded annual growth rate. And so you really want to focus as to how much do I really need? Do I really need 6 years of cash? Probably not. So that's the kind of the number one consideration I think about, because if you have other assets, stocks, certain kinds of bonds, other things, your commodities, gold, Bitcoin, all that sort of stuff, that has a potentially much higher CAGR, compounded annual growth rate. Where you get in trouble with those is on this factor, volatility. The more volatile your overall portfolio is, the lower the safe withdrawal rate is going to be. And that is related to this maximum drawdown. This ends up being a big factor for any portfolio. And there are two issues here. One is, what is the maximum drawdown in terms of depth? Does this thing go down 20, 30, 40% historically? The other is length. How long does this typically stay underwater? Is it 3 years? Is it 13 years? If you have a well-diversified portfolio, it's probably closer to 3 years that you could expect it to be underwater. If you just have a plain old stock portfolio or something that's just stock and aggregate bond fund, you could expect up to 13 years of a drawdown, like from 1999 to 2012, last time we had something like that. So it behooves you to think about really diversifying outside of just a bunch of stock funds and a bond fund. That will usually work most of the time, and what I can also say is that most portfolios will work fine most of the time. It's just a fact of the way the 4% rule and safe withdrawal rates work. Those averages were created, and those limits were created not using an optimized portfolio for this. That portfolio that Bengen was working with and people work with, that's not optimized for withdrawals at all. It's just a very basic thing that somebody might hold. And so when you are constructing your portfolio, each one has a separate safe withdrawal rate or projected safe withdrawal rate. The other thing you often want to look at when you're doing these analyses on Portfolio Visualizer or portfolio charts is you'll see what are known as risk-reward ratios. Something called the Sharpe ratio, something called the Sortino ratio, something called the Trainer percentage. All of those are measurements of risk and reward. And what they give you is a way to compare a couple different portfolios over a given time series. Unfortunately, there is no one risk-reward ratio that ever applies to one portfolio because it's always dictated by the time period. That a portfolio that has a very high Sharpe ratio for the past 10 years is probably going to have a pretty lousy one for the 10 years preceding that. So when you are also looking at that, the more data you have for your analysis, the more comfortable you're going to be able to say that this portfolio is probably going to perform better than this one over a long period of time based on these Sharpe and Sortino ratios. Those pop right out when you do these analyses over at Portfolio Visualizer in particular, but that is a good way of thinking about or measuring what is a good setup and what's a bad setup. So when you go to portfolio charts, there is a safe withdrawal rate graph calculator thing that pops out whenever you put in your portfolio. And on this axis is withdrawal rate. And on this axis is retirement length. And you'll see something that looks kind of like this, and this will be like, 10 years, 20 years, 30, 40. You'll see a safe withdrawal rate graph coming up from here and then evening out somewhere along there. You'll see what's called a PWR, permanent withdrawal rate thing, coming up from here. Now, what are these? This gives you for your portfolio that you stick in, a projected safe withdrawal rate, and then you can look at for 30 years and can go up there, 20 years there. It's going to be different depending on the number of years. And this is how you deal with this problem with, it's 30 years. Well, okay, well, you can put in a different number of years for these things and get what you want out of them. What you do find, though, is that they will have this kind of smoothing out and going down to a horizontal line over time, that the difference between 20 and 30 is going to be a lot more than the difference between 30 and 40. But the idea of a safe withdrawal rate, remember, is this. That is the number that you could theoretically withdraw under this constant withdrawal strategy that you're stuck with, and still have money at the end. That's what a safe withdrawal rate is. This PWR is different. This PWR is saying, I still want to have the same amount of money I started with at the end. So this PWR is, I have $1 million. I want to know, what is my withdrawal rate forever that I will still end up with that same $1 million at the end of the period that I did at the beginning of the period. So the safe withdrawal rate is always higher than the permanent withdrawal rate. They do converge. The math works out that over long periods of time, they end up converging. But this gives you kind of a very gap. So you might end up with something that looks like 5.5% there and 4.5% there, depending on what kind of portfolio you're looking at. So just to give you a sense of what different kinds of portfolios using this calculator have been since 1970. So a 60-40 portfolio, if you run it in, that is basically the kind of thing that Bengen was talking about. 60% total stock market or S&P 500, 40% intermediate treasury bonds. That ends up having a, we'll call this port, we'll call this SWR, we'll call this PWR. That ends up getting you here at about 4.4 and 3.4.
At what point?
One?
At what point?
30 years. 30 years. These are 30-year topics. So you'll notice that it's actually more than 4. The reason that is that this data set only goes back to 1970, and so it does not include those few years. If you were to go back to 66 or 67, this would go down to the 4. But it also tells you that that being the worst period in our entire lifetime, that most of the time it's going to be more than 4 for this. And so that's just not running out of money. 100% equity. What if you want, I'm just going to ride that pony and keep 100% equity. You get 4.3 here and 3.4 here. And that's what's funny about it, because this has a higher compounded annual growth rate than that over this period of time. But the reason this number is lower has to do with those length of drawdown and depth of drawdown. That this has less of that, and so when you're taking money out of it, you end up getting a higher safe withdrawal rate and a similar permanent withdrawal rate. So that I mean, that's just a good illustration as to what you're actually trying to do in portfolio construction here is you're trying to reduce the volatility of the portfolio from the 100% equity without reducing the compounded annual growth rate too much. That your goal is, I want a lot less volatility, but I don't want to cut my returns down too much. Where you have the problem there is if you have too much cash in your portfolio. So if you were going to take this 100% portfolio and say, well, I'm just going to have 30% in cash, that is going to reduce proportionally both the compounded annual growth rate and the volatility, because it's not really a whole lot of diversification. It's just performing like a portfolio with only 70% of the assets in it. Once you start using things like bonds that are actually diversified in a meaningful way and generate a meaningful return, then you are going to get better characteristics in terms of reducing the volatility of the portfolio, but not reducing the returns that much. So I'll give you another. This is one from the site that was invented by the guy who runs the portfolio charts site. It's called the Golden Butterfly. And he's an engineer, got all this data from Bogleheads and created this whole site. It's fabulous. But anyway, what he's looking at here is a portfolio that is divided into 5 20s. 1, 2, 3, 4. First one is total stock market. Second one is small cap value fund. Third one is long-term treasury bond fund. Fourth one is gold, 20%. And the fifth one is the cash equivalent, the 20% in short-term bonds. This thing turns out to have an historical safe withdrawal rate of 6.3 and a permanent withdrawal rate of 5.1. What you should learn from this is not necessarily that that's the portfolio you want, but simply that these numbers can change a lot depending on what you're putting in here. That the incorrect assumption I see most people make is that the 4% rule somehow applies to whatever they're holding. And it just doesn't. Some other number applies to what they're holding. And so one of the things you want to do before you pull the plug on retirement is go, well, what am I holding and what are its projected safe withdrawal rates and permanent withdrawal rates? And am I comfortable with that? You may still want to keep your portfolio even if it has lower numbers than these projections, just out of comfort, or you're getting your income from somebody else, from somewhere else. But just knowing what these are, I think is just important. We can't be walking around with a portfolio being ignorant of sort of the basic facts of what it would have been like to hold that thing for the past 50 years. There's another version of this that I like to use, that I actually use. It's called the golden ratio. And what is this? 42, 26, 16, 10, 6. It's 42% in stocks, divided into, you could divide it into anything, but what I typically, the simplest construction of that is half large cap growth and half small cap value. You can put any number of variations of what you want in there. International stocks, different sectors. The idea is it's 42% in base equities, diversified. 26% in long-term treasury bonds. People hate long-term treasury bonds, but the reason you have these portfolios have these is they are negatively correlated with stocks. When the stock market crashes, these go up. In 2020, for example, March 2020, stock market down 35% in March. Long-term treasury bonds up 25%. As in terms of diversifying your portfolio, it's very difficult to beat that as a diversifier. The problem people don't like about it is most of the time when this is making money, that's losing money. Last year, these were up 27% on average. These were down 8% on average. That's what diversification means, though, in a portfolio. If you're looking at your portfolio, if it's diversified, some things are going to be doing poorly all the time. There's always going to be something doing poorly. But the idea is something else is going to be doing well. And when stocks are doing well, everything else is going to be doing poorly. Next one here, the 16, that's gold. A lot of studies now have been done on the use of gold in a portfolio. It's not popular in the United States. It's very popular outside of the United States. I have a lot of people who write into my podcast who are from places like Sweden and France and all sorts of other places. They're having trouble holding gold because they know over years and years and years it's worked. And the other thing you want to look at is, if you're familiar with big earned safe withdrawal rate, series sequence of return risk, go to number 34. He did a 100-year analysis, just using a simple portfolio that was stocks, bonds, and gold, and determined that kind of the optimal amount of gold to have in a portfolio is about 10 to 15%. About 10 to 15% for most portfolios. The reason it works is not because it has a great return characteristics, is it has about a zero correlation to these two things. It's volatile enough that it does go up and down, and so ends up being kind of the third leg on this kind of little stool here that you're talking about. This 10% I've got is Reits. They tend to work pretty well. They have a relatively low correlation to their total stock market and these other things. A typical REIT fund is maybe got a 0.5 correlation number. And I should say that is also a must-use tool. When people talk about diversification, unfortunately, they talk too much often about narrative diversification. I think this is different than that. We need to get around that thinking and go to the data and the numerical thing about that. And how you do that, if you go to Portfolio Visualizer, there's a nice little thing, asset correlation. Put in your funds. It's going to spit out correlation numbers from -1 to +1. The closer to +1 means they're more correlated. They're not diversified. Particularly anything over like 0.9. Most of your big stock funds are all going to have 0.9 plus. That is not diversified. That's what that means. It's not it's maybe different, but it's not diversified. -1 is the most diversified. These are the things. This means when this is negative, it means that typically when the one thing's going up, the other one's going down. So long-term treasury bonds have a negative correlation. There are very few things that have negative correlations with the stock market. That's one of them, and it has a negative number here. A lot of the other things are weird things like investing in volatility and options and things like that. And then you'll find most things, other things are in sort of, they're closer to 0, which means uncorrelated, which just means when one is going up or down, the other one could be going up or down in a random fashion. And that's what if you put in gold, it's going to come out near 0 for that. You put in rates or something, depending on what fund you're using, they're going to be anywhere, usually 0.4 to 0.6. That's a good low correlation number between two things that you expect to grow. The only other sector that has that kind of low correlation in the stock market sectors is the utility sector. But they're harder to use, and they have a lower compounded annual growth rate than REITs do. So they end up being a good thing to use. I typically don't use the REIT funds, but I use individual REITs because they're well-developed, diversified businesses in and of themselves oftentimes. For instance, there's one called Realty Inc. It's ticker symbol O. It has 6,000 leases or something like that on convenience stores and pharmacies and things like that. As a real estate empire, it is diversified amongst all of those things. But you can get REITs that invest in storage, public storage, things that do cell towers, My favorite one these days is called IIPR. It invests in warehouses to grow marijuana. It is essentially you're selling, instead of mining the gold, you're selling the shovels to the gold miners, is basically the way I look at that one. But anyway, you can take small portions of those, and I added them up to 10 in what I do here. I should say what these come out to is what's the final 6%? Cash or short-term bonds. These numbers come out to these. And you'll notice, I mean, this is lower than that. It's still extremely good. The reason I like it is just it actually has a higher compounded annual growth rate. I don't like having all of these. I think 20% is really a lot to have in short-term bonds or cash. That's a lot because that's just, it's not doing a whole lot. I think a smaller number is probably appropriate. That's basically 1.5 years. 6. If you're thinking of, I'm taking about 4 or 5, it's 1 to 1.5 years of money. But you'll see that by putting in different things, you're going to get different numbers that you can get comfortable with. But you also do need to be comfortable with just, well, how does it perform? What's nice about today is that with no fee trading and fractional shares, you can go create one of these things. Go to Fidelity, open an account, put $1,000 in there. You can make it as diverse as you want. And then, ride it, see what it's like. How does it perform over the next couple of years, even before you get retired? Because knowing what that thing you're thinking of living with, how it actually goes down the road, ends up giving you a lot more comfort. And so, I was experimenting with portfolios for about 10 years before I settle on something like this. I have things that are much more complicated than that, like commodity funds and other things like that, but that's kind of the base where I come out with that. Let's see here. And what I actually do in our podcast is I have 7 sample portfolios, from a very conservative one to ones involving huge amounts of leverage and leveraged funds. So you can get an idea of how these different kinds of diversified portfolios play out over time. We actually put the money in 1.5 years ago. We remove money every month on a distribution schedule, and then we see how they play out and what they're like to road test, if you will. I think that road testing a portfolio is a very important thing that people should be thinking about doing before they pull the plug, so they're very comfortable with it. Because what usually will happen is you'll get to your FI number before you actually pull the plug on employment, whatever. And so you can get your portfolio all set up so it's in retirement mode. And for instance, I had mine in that mode for 4 years before I pulled the plug. And that way I knew that it was going to be fine, that a portfolio particularly like these, they're going to continue to grow just in terms of compounded annual growth rates. You're probably aware that 100% equity portfolio after inflation over 100 years is about 8%, 10% nominal, 8% real. This one, these come in at about, this one's probably 80% of that, and this one's about 85% of that. And what's happening here is you're going to get half of the volatility, but about 85% of the returns with a well-diversified portfolio. And that's what you're trying to do in portfolio construction for retirement, is lower the volatility without lowering the returns too much. The things that lower the returns too much are cash, tips, those sorts of things. They just do. So you need to think about, well, what are more diversified things that still yield a reasonable return or some return? Even gold has some return over long periods of time, just because it keeps up with inflation, but it's very volatile through that. So you end up over time, do generating some return out of these other things, but it's a return that comes at different times than your stock market returns come, and so that's how it works mechanically or mathematically. All right, I think we're probably getting close to time, so do we have other questions that people want to talk about? People are hungry?
So it seems like I'll just use the 100% equity as an example. So a lot of that is based, his projections are based off of actually tapping into the principal. And for example, I use me. My retirement strategy is essentially a dividend paying stock portfolio,
Okay.
where all I'm doing is ever living off of the dividends and never actually tapping the principal, the actual holdings. Do you see any holes in that? Because basically, it seems like it's reducing.
Well, you're limiting yourself in a way that you might not need to or want to. Because the nice thing about liquid financial assets is that you can just sell them. If you are what you're basically doing is taking a liquid financial asset and turning it into that illiquid income generating asset. When we're going back to those categories. So you're taking a financial stock portfolio and treating it like a rental. It can work. If you run numbers with those kinds of dividend funds, you'll find they tend to have a lower compounded annual growth rate overall. So it tends to be a little bit lower. Depending on which kinds of funds you're using. I would be very concerned if you are trying to do this using these newfangled fad funds that are buy right option strategies, QYLD, those sorts of things. Those tend to have a much lower overall return than the market, and that kind of fund has gone through fads. First in the 1980s, then in the early 2000s, and now. What happens is they become popular for a while, people see them blow up in a crisis, and then they become unpopular for a while. People forget, and they start using them again. So I would be worried about something like that. I would not be concerned, and it's going to work fine if you're just using, for instance, Reits and dividend-generating funds to do that. Depending on your income level, another a useful kind of fund for that purpose is a preferred shares fund like PFF. That will generate you income. It does a better job in generating income than ordinary dividend stocks because preferred shares are designed to generate income. That's how they're structured. They're kind of bond-like. So it gives you a higher, more steady return. It also is very moderate since most of the returns are being paid out in the form of dividends. And so in terms of having a low volatility component, that can be useful. And I use those for income generating. The other thing that they're useful and the reason why you like those as opposed to say REIT income is that preferred shares pay a qualified dividend. A qualified dividend, it's also paid by most dividend stocks, is taxed at a long-term capital gains tax rates, which for you is probably going to be 0 or 15%, unless you have an income over $500,000, and it's 20%. But so if you're thinking about location, we didn't get to that, you'd want to put, say, REITs in your retirement accounts because they pay ordinary dividends. They're taxed at your ordinary income tax rate. You have preferred shares, other dividend things, you can put those in your taxable account because then they're going to be taxed at the lower rate. If you put them in the retirement accounts and they pay their dividends there and you take the money out, you get taxed at the ordinary income rate. So somebody like Rick Ferry, for example, his personal portfolio, instead of having corporate bonds, because he's in a high tax bracket, he uses preferred shares and municipal bonds. Now, he's probably drawing over $500,000 a year, I would imagine. But I always think it's interesting to look at the personal portfolios of the famous gurus who are out there advocating things, because typically they do not look like what they're necessarily telling other people to invest in. A lot of times there's good reasons for that have to do with taxes and other things. But I always feel like, well, if they are personally going to invest in this sort of thing, it must have some value for some people somewhere. And so I almost memorize these things. Ferry's got the preferred shares and municipal bonds. Bill Bengen has only 25% of stocks in his portfolio, 5% gold, rest fixed income. It's amazing what you see out there from the people that know the most. Their portfolios do not look like a 60-40. They never do.
Quick question. Do these factor in expense ratios as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And in fact, if you go to the Portfolio Charts website, he's got a thing that basically tells you, like, if you want a small cap value fund, here's a suggestion with a low expense ratio. He's very interested in the international world, so if you lived in Sweden, you could change the country name to Sweden. It'll tell you what fund you could buy in Sweden. That's a small cap value fund or something else like that. But that's another nice feature he added last year that I think is very helpful, because what's also true is that as we go along in time, there are more and more low-cost ETFs in all of these categories. So for example, for long-term treasury bonds, the sort of standard for that has been TLT for the past 20 years. More recently, though, Vanguard came out with VGLT. Schwab has a different version that have a lower expense ratio. And as time has gone on, there's people, the purveyors of these funds have recognized there's a great demand for more specific kinds of funds than there used to be, and at lower expense ratios. So there's a nice competition going on out there to find the lowest expense ratios and things.
Just briefly, I wanted to ask about leveraged funds, which you mentioned.
Yeah.
I was recently just kind of considering investing in a leveraged like S&P fund, S&P 500 fund. Let's say I put in 5% of my portfolio in that. Is that going to make any real impact, or is there any reason I shouldn't do that?
It will have an impact over time. It's like if it's UPRO, for example, UPRO, the 3 times leveraged S&P 500 fund. It behaves as if it were 15% in your portfolio. Those things have only been around since about 2009. So the real question is, over long period, they're not, and a lot of them really aren't designed for long-term holding. But in fact, they've worked for the people who have used them for the past decade, and even through the financial crisis in March 2020, they performed as advertised. They did go down, I think, 80%, and then went back up. What was funny is if you held the UPRO 3 times leveraged S&P 500 fund, and you also held the TMF, the leveraged long-term treasury bond fund, the S&P 500 fund went down about 80% during that crisis. The leveraged long-term bond fund went up 65%. And so people who are managing that held both of those. You do a rebalancing. And that's also how you can generate more return out of things like that. These are experimental things. I have a few of these things on my website as experimental portfolios, because I'm wondering the same thing. In theory, and there is a good YouTube video put out by Ben Felix, does the Rational Reminder podcast. This came out a couple of years ago, and he talks about leverage in a portfolio. There are academic papers that suggest that in an accumulation portfolio, leverage is a better way to get a better return than forms of diversification or other ways of doing that. So this is on the frontier of stuff. I wouldn't bet I wouldn't bet the farm on it. But if you wanted to run an experiment with it or use a little bit of your accumulation portfolio to do something like that, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's not as risky as many other things I see people doing. So go cautiously, but don't be afraid to go. The other kinds of leverage portfolios that are coming out these days are mixed ones. There's one called NTSX, which is a mixture of an S&P 500 portfolio with some options and futures on treasury bonds. So basically, it's like a 60-40 portfolio that's leveraged up 1.5 times. So it's like a 90-60 portfolio. It's only been out for 3 years. But that is actually designed as a long-term holding, as opposed to those 3-time leverage things that have been around for 10 or 12 years. Those are designed for traders to go in and out of stuff. So this is another area I think that is developing, and it will be interesting to see how it comes out. Because in theory, you put leverage into one of these things, as long as it can survive, you're going to get safe withdrawal rates that are 8, 9, 10%, in theory. Whether that works out remains to be seen, because they just haven't been around that long.
When Frank told me this presentation is going to be 5 hours long, I was a little surprised, but like I'm not. But I think that he was going strong in hour 2 and hour 3. And with that said, I want to give him a round of applause.